Hey, on behalf of Cornerstone University, I want to welcome you to Christ Chapel for tonight's ever-important wisdom conversation. Now, whether you're a staff or a faculty member or a member of the community or a student here, welcome. Can I just say it's a pleasure to have you here. It's great to be here. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Cole Moore. I'm a senior here at Cornerstone. I'm double majoring in ministry and in biblical studies, and I have the privilege of serving with Cornerstone's Department of Spiritual Formation and Christian Community as our chapel intern. I also serve as an RA in the legendary Quincer Hall. I love this school, I love the community that is here, and I am thrilled that you are here tonight to join us for tonight's wisdom conversation as part of that community. This is the 7th wisdom conversation that's been hosted by Cornerstone, and the purpose of these conversations is to provide a platform for respectful and challenging discussions to further equip us to live out our faith in the world. Now tonight, our president, Dr. Gerson Moreno-Mariano, and our panel of esteemed guests will be discussing the topic of loneliness, the loneliness epidemic that is running rampant in our digital world. Now this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, both in research and in experience. I was able to research some of the causes and consequences of loneliness in teenage males for one of my senior research papers, and I've experienced the effects, the painful disconnection that loneliness brings us at many points throughout my life. I'm also aware that many of us in this chapel can say the same. This is an epidemic that holds no bias. Regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic standing, loneliness affects us all. In fact, studies show that more than half of adults in America report feeling lonely. And 61% of people between the ages of 18 to 25 feel substantial loneliness. 61%. This is something that we must take seriously, especially as the children of our great God, as members of the greatest family that the world has ever known. Children who are called to be agents of reconciliation in this world. Now, I'm not here to preach to you as much as I wish I could, but I am excited to hear our panel's perspective and counsel on how we can bring Christ-centered healing to our lonely world. And I'm excited to have you along for the ride. Now, before we kick off our evening, I would like to open us with a word of prayer before I introduce our president. So would you bow your heads? Would you pray with me? Our great God, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Lord, to have a hard but an important discussion on such a topic like loneliness. God, I pray that you would open our eyes, help us to learn tonight, God. Help us to take something away. We pray that you would bless this time, bless this discussion, bless this panel. And Lord, would you just help us to be changed, Lord, to be equipped to go and to change the world, to influence the world for Christ through our conversation tonight. Lord, we love you and we thank you. We give you this time and we ask that you do great things with it. In Jesus' name, amen. Now, allow me to introduce our president to you all. He immigrated into the United States from Colombia when he was 9 years old. He holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cincinnati. He has several publications to his name, including 6 books, as well as other published book chapters and scholarly articles. He has served as both a professor and an administrator in Christian higher education for over 2 decades. And finally, for what I would argue is his greatest career achievement of all, he serves as the 12th president of Cornerstone University, leading with a vision of influencing the church in America by raising up men and women to love Jesus Christ and to bow to his word in every aspect of their lives. He's a husband, he's a father of 6, and a fun fact for you all, and I've witnessed this firsthand, he is an absolute threat under the net in intramural basketball. He's great. It was great to watch. But most importantly, he is a man deeply committed to following Christ himself, and our school is blessed to have him. So ladies and gentlemen, would you put your hands together and help me to welcome our moderator for our conversation and our president, Dr. Gerson Moreno-Mariano.
Thank you, Cole. Good evening, everyone. I have to confess that when I played intramural basketball, I was told it would be easy. And I walked in and all the students were slamming and dunking in. And I thought, I am in trouble tonight. Cole, thank you for being here and serving. Welcome, everyone. It's amazing. Our 7th Wisdom Conversations. In 2022, we started with 252 attendees. We have over 800 tonight. Thank you for being here. Let's give ourselves a round of applause and thank our Lord for that. Thank you for being here. It's a very, very important conversation we're having. I want to ensure we offer gratitude not just to our Lord, but also to so many people who helped us to do this event. It's impossible without people. And two that I want to recognize is Christina Garverlink and John Coleman AV. Would you please join me in thanking them both for all the work that they did? And there's so many other staff and faculty involved. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I also want to recognize our sponsors. Thank you for your support for Wisdom Conversations in Cornerstone University. I want to also acknowledge the men and women with whom I serve, our wonderful Board of Trustees. Board members, if you're here, would you please stand so we can honor you? And Dr. Rick Kuhl there in the front is our chair of the board. Thank you for being here, Dr. Kuhl. Thank you, trustees, for being here with us. Cornerstone University is honored to introduce tonight's distinguished guests. Your programs, ladies and gentlemen, include full-length bios that reflect their incredible impact. Our first guest is Dr. Sohrab Ahmari. He is the U.S. editor of Unheard. Prior to that, he co-founded Compact Magazine. He spent nearly a decade in News Corp as an editor and columnist with the Wall Street Journal opinion pages in both New York and London, and the op-ed editor for the New York Post. His books include Tyranny, Inc., How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It, and The Unbroken Thread, Discovering the Wisdom of Tradition in an Age of Chaos, both published by Penguin Random House. His next book, a fascinating book, On the Triumph of Normality, will be published by HarperCollins. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sohrab Ahmari. Great to have you with us. Our second guest is Dr. Jane Twenge. Dr. Twenge is a psychologist, author, and professor of psychology at San Diego State University. Dr. Twenge has authored over 190 scientific publications and 7 books, including Generations, The Real Differences Between Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, Boomers, and Silence, and What They Mean for America's Future. Dr. Twenge's research on generational differences has been covered in Time, Newsweek, the New York Times, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and the Washington Post. And her many TV appearances feature NBC Nightly News, Fox and Friends, CBS This Morning, Real Time with Bill Maher, and National Public Radio. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Jane Twenge? It's great to have you here, Jane.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our third guest is Chaitali Sinha. She is the Chief Clinical Research and Development Officer for Wysa, an artificial-driven mental health platform and app. Sinha is a psychologist, researcher, and therapist with clinical expertise across digital, judicial, rural, and trauma-focused settings. Sinha is currently a co-author on over 20 press or under peer review publications, and the inventor on 2 patents. Her work focuses on mental health, including digital mental health interventions, working with Wysa's key clients both in the public sector and academia. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Chaitali Sinha? Chaitali Sinha. Welcome, Chaitali. Thank you for being here. Thank you. And our fourth and final guest is Dr. Mark Mayfield. He spoke in chapel here to our students yesterday in a wonderful service. He's a former pastor, award-winning author, certified master Christian coach, and mental health counselor. He's an assistant professor of clinical mental health counseling at Colorado Christian University and the editor of Marriage and Family, a Christian journal. He has extensive experience in consulting on mental and emotional health issues for churches, faith communities, as well as other organizations. And he founded No Student Unseen. A trauma expert, Dr. Mayfield works closely with families and serves as the Director of National Advancement for Life Counseling Plus. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mayfield. Good to see you. Would you, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists one more time. Thank you for being here all. And I want to begin tonight's conversation, colleagues, with the question of why the stigma around loneliness. One of the things that was interesting to me as we put this topic together 6 months ago, there were colleagues and members of the community who said to me, it's such a negative topic. Why would you want to do it? It's so negative. And yet yesterday when you spoke in chapel, Dr. Mayfield, there were some of our students were crying. You touched something deep. Even one of our photographers tonight, when Jean and I were speaking, said to us, this is such a great topic. Thank you for doing this. But maybe we can start talking together about the stigma. Why the worry about talking about this publicly? Jean, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I think some of it just comes from sometimes when people feel lonely, they feel ashamed of it. Like, I should have these relationships. Maybe it was my fault. You know, what happened? And I think that can really contribute to that feeling of this is so negative and I don't really want to talk about it.
Chaitali, you mentioned a book you were reading on loneliness that touched on this issue of stigma. Maybe you can share with us in the audience, but that was wonderful as a follow-up to Jean's comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, adding to what Jean said, that there's a lack of self-worth that you also start feeling when there's loneliness, and all of it kind of compounds together, right? So you're not really sure whom to share this with, and is this something that should be talked about? And what I was sharing with you earlier, sir, was that I think in communities where there is faith, where there's belonging, and we've been taught to believe in the best of ourselves and in the best of people around us, it's also hard to talk about topics that feel dense, that feel negative. That is this something that should be spoken about? Why am I feeling this way? I'm supposed to be better than this. I'm supposed to feel connected to everyone around me. Mm-hmm. So where's the space to talk about disconnection?
Dr. Mayfield?
Yeah, I love that, because I think we put a lot of shoulds on ourselves. We should be a certain way. We should feel a certain way. If I have this faith, then I shouldn't feel this way. And it takes the humanity out of it in a lot of ways. And I think there's two things that we have to come to grips with, that if we admit that we're lonely, we're admitting that we need to be vulnerable. Yeah. And that is a scary place for many people. And I think the second thing is if we have to be vulnerable, who can we trust? Yeah. And a lot of times we've been hurt so many, over and over and over again in relationships that we don't know where to turn. And that's, for me, it's an advocacy for, a temporary paid friend, as, Irving Yalom would say, to find a counselor that maybe you can start bridging that gap and building that back. But we've got to learn how to pick safe people, because if not, we're going to just replicate this over and over again, in my opinion.
Rob, what do you think?
Well, so many of my colleagues have already addressed the stigma aspect, so I figured maybe I would do a corollary sentiment that goes with it, which is temptation. That is, so often technology, especially as a driver of our loneliness, and I know we'll get into the nitty-gritty of it, but technology and also the marketing that goes with it, the entire apparatus of marketing wants to tempt us and then help us to rationalize that the asocial, antisocial behaviors that we're engaging in or forced to engage in are actually making us feel connected. Mm-hmm. And I say this as, I'm married, we have 2 children. My wife and I are about as intentional as you can be in trying to not let our lives get driven by that. But sometimes after the kids are put to bed and the day is done, we found ourselves sitting on opposite ends of the couch, each of us looking at our phones separately. And it requires an act of deliberate awareness to sort of be like, hey, wait a second, this is the moment to not do that. This is the moment to ask each other, how was your day? What's troubling you? That's within a much smaller community, the community of the family, the basis of all other communities. That can happen. Now replicate that across so many other dimensions of life where people are, feeling like a kind of pseudo or parasocial connection, arguing with people on Facebook or Twitter, or posting little videos of themselves getting a kind of little gratification out of a like, and then feeling a profound sense of loneliness or crisis when they don't get that endorphin hit that comes with getting likes. So there's stigma, but there's also then temptation and self-rationalization or coping.
Each of you has written on loneliness and work. Maybe you can share with the audience here at Cornerstone why this topic, what attracted you to it, why you're here this evening, besides just the invitation, and thank you for coming, but also why is this so important, Mark?
Yeah, I shared this yesterday in chapel, but a profound sense of loneliness in my middle school years and childhood, throughout my traumas that led me to an attempted suicide. And so never wanting anybody to feel that way as I worked my way out of that through psychologists and medication and help, but also through community. But as an individual that has somehow been placed in family therapy, trauma therapy, and suicidology, just seeing that it's a driving force behind our mental health epidemic. And I often rationalize with people that I talk with that I don't think we have a mental health epidemic. I think we have a loneliness epidemic. And if we were to actually take care of that core need of being seen, being known, being valued, being loved, anxiety would go down, suicides would go down, overdoses would go down, anxiety and depression would go down in our teenagers and our young adults and our older adults. So just a passion to see, because I know what it feels like to be unknown and not seen, and the beauty of actually somebody getting you and not trying to fix you or judge you or shame you, but just go, okay, I'm here, and I want to know your story, had a profound impact on my life.
Thank you. Chaitali?
I think two things. One, personally, this was a topic that I would often think about even as an adolescent, that 7 billion people in the world, but we all feel so distant from each other sometimes. How is that possible, right? Just given the sheer volume of people in this world. And also because of the work that I'm currently engaging in, that we're building out, we have a digital mental health app that delivers brief mental health interventions to anyone who's utilizing the application. So is this something that's a bane or a boon? I think that philosophical, that existential question has always sat at the bottom of the work that I'm doing right now. That is this something that can actually help? How is it helping? And can we actually study that?
Thank you. Jean?
Yeah, I feel like this topic of belonging and loneliness has been following me around in both my career and my personal life forever. Personally, I was very lonely in my 20s, and then later in my 20s started a postdoc with someone who published a paper on the fundamental need to belong. And that paper's been cited thousands of times, and it's such a core idea that this is what we were meant to do as humans, is to be around each other. That is just so completely fundamental. And it's extremely rare to find the true hermit or the true loner. One of my favorite little kind of side papers that I remember reading that someone did, I thought was brilliant. It was no one is an island. And because they found even people who said, I'm not so sure about relationships and so on, when they had somebody accept them, they actually responded even more positively than the people who were very much upfront about liking relationships. And that whole field really had a big impact on me, and made me also think about my personal experience in terms of being alone and realizing in some ways that that's just kind of not how we were meant to be, and that loneliness is like an alarm clock that tells us we need to seek that social interaction. So it does serve a fundamental purpose. And more recently, I ended up getting into this topic, kind of stumbling across it, because my main job is to work with really big data sets of teens who have filled out surveys across the country and the world. And I started to see these changes that were enormous. I'd been doing the generations work for decades at this point, but I'd never seen anything like this. That more and more teens started to say that they felt lonely, more started to say that they felt left out. Then those same trends started to show up in depression, because to Mark's point, these two are very intertwined with each other. When you're lonely, then you're more likely to be depressed. Plus, around the same time, started looking in those surveys at how are teens spending their time. And there's a bunch of questions in these surveys about, do you go out with your friends and without your parents? Do you drive around in a car just for fun? Do you go to the mall? Do you go to the movies? Do you just hang out with your friends informally? All of those have just plummeted. And then in other data sets, like where they actually ask how many minutes per day are you spending with social interaction with other people, among teens and young adults, those numbers have been cut in half since 2012. So that just made me realize how enormous a problem this is, and that we probably need to think about what we're going to do about it, which I know we'll get to later.
Sohrab?
Yeah, so one of my books, The Unbroken Thread, is written for and dedicated to, I have 2 kids, to my son. His name is Max, but the full name is Maximilian. And he's named after Saint Maximilian Kolbe. I'm sure many of you have heard his story. He was a Polish Franciscan friar who was arrested because obviously when Poland was invaded by the Nazis, he was engaging in anti-Nazi activities, running anti-Nazi newspapers, broadcasting anti-Nazi radio stations and so on. And so they arrested him and they took him to Auschwitz. And then at one point, someone from his particular block escaped. And the typical punishment was that they would choose 10 men from the block to die randomly to die of starvation. And so when all the men on the block lined up and the Nazi commandant picked 10 men, he was not, Father Maximilian was not one of the ones who was picked. But when he saw that one of the men went and said, broke down and said, "My wife, my children," St. Maximilian stepped forward and said, I will go in his place. And so when I heard that story, I was about to convert to Catholicism, and to become a father, so I named my son after St. Maximilian. And my determination was to sort of lasso my son to this ideal, to this example of maximum supernatural love, the fullest giving of the self for the other. And to get there, to begin for him to grow into the person that his namesake was, God forbid, I hope he doesn't have to go through a historical trauma like that, but to begin to fulfill that ideal, he needs to at least begin to be naturally fully human. Naturally, forget about the supernatural, begin with the naturally fully human, and that means to be a social animal. And you can't do that if you're isolated, if your entire world is this small world of screens, or even if you have relationships, but they're purely based on transactionality, about exchange value, about trying to get something out of the other, that's not looking at the other person as fully a human being and deserving of the dignity of the human being, as St. Maximilian Kolbe did. So it's very personal for me. And I should say I'm of the political right. I'm right of center. But I've always been a little bit uncomfortable with the way in which some of us on the right look at social crises or cultural crises, declining family formation, loneliness, of course, collapsing fertility, and so on, and don't think about how the way we structure our political economy and our wider systems might be contributing to those. And nowhere do we see that more clearly than in the loneliness epidemic. So I'm looking forward to get into the nitty-gritty of it.
Great, thank you. You mentioned the belonging piece. I want to talk together for our audience about how we define loneliness. This is not an easy thing. When the Surgeon General published his report in 2023, it was hard to pin down what this thing was. Mm-hmm. There was social connectedness, social disconnectedness, isolation, enemy, alienation, all these different concepts, somewhat related. And then it made me also ponder, what's the opposite of loneliness then? How do we talk about that? And the best idea I could think of was this word that we use in the scriptures and in Christianity and communion. Mm-hmm. It's one of the ordinances that Christ has given his followers. Yeah. Right. And in Matthew, when you see Christ and sharing the Last Supper with his followers, eat, this is my body, drink, this is my blood, you realize this intimacy that maybe loneliness is no intimacy. But I just want to throw that out for us to think about together. How do we define this? Because I think if we're going to walk away with wisdom and a sense of what this is, I think we need to know what we're talking about, so then we can talk about the opposite as well. Jean?
Yeah. I was just going to say, we have to distinguish one really important first step. You have to distinguish between being alone and being lonely, because those are two different things. Yep. It is entirely possible to be alone and be enjoying yourself, and everybody needs quiet time from time to time. And there are people who don't need as much social interaction, and they're totally fine with that. So it's feeling, it's the perception, it's the psychology of it, not just the experience. But with that said, on average, if people are not seeing each other in person as much, then you're going to have an increase in loneliness. So then, what is that? Well, it's subjective. Research psychologists like me, we have a great out. We just say, how do we define it? Well, how we measure it. Well, how do you measure it? It's how we define it. We have this nice little circle that we do. But the measures are pretty straightforward. There are things like I feel left out, I feel lonely, I feel like I don't have anyone to count on, as opposed to I have friends who I can depend on. So it is true, it's multifaceted. There's that feeling of belonging, there's a feeling of connectedness, but it is feeling, it is perception. So the same person could have this, compared to somebody else, one person could have lots of social interaction and still feel somewhat lonely, and another person could have less and not feel lonely, but it's still an awful, awful feeling. It gnaws at people. It is that alarm that is telling us something is wrong, because it's just so fundamental to need connection, belonging, all of those things.
Yeah. I would say, I like that, and I think I would add, and I had to create a definition for my book, The Path Out of Loneliness, just to have something to center it around, right? So if not, then why are we writing it? And I would say, to me, it's the state of being unseen or unnoticed. And I think there can be feelings in there, but after a while, we give into those feelings and it becomes a state of being. And so the state of being unseen or unnoticed, mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And I believe it can be because of a lack of identity or purpose, and where's my place? And Cigna did a really great study, 20,000 participants in 2021 or 2020, and it was huge, where 36% of people felt like they had nobody they can turn to. I mean, that creates a sense of hopelessness. And I think when we get to a state of being lonely, pervasive loneliness is where hopelessness sets in. And I think is we have to differentiate, like you said, there's a differentiation between bouts of being lonely and then pervasive loneliness. And with the teens I work with a lot, and it's helping them recognize you're dealing with bouts of feeling lonely. How do we make sure that it doesn't spiral into a place of pervasive loneliness?
And just to jump in real quick, I mean, the thing that came to mind too when you were talking is there is that unseen piece, but I think there's some subtleties to it as well, of someone who maybe seems very successful at work but doesn't have any truly close relationships.
Yep.
So they might be seen and they might be respected, but who's going to actually come to their funeral and cry?
Right.
Maybe nobody.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Chaitali, I want to ask you on topic, how did you and your team with this mental health app, chatbot, measure or operationalize this in a way that the respondent can equate, right? How much testing went into this?
I think the way in which we defined loneliness across generations was disconnection within and without. So externally as well as internally, right? So if you're disconnected from your own self, then it's really hard to build meaningful relationships outside too. And that was kind of the role that we saw something like an app play, that if you can talk to a chatbot and work through your social anxiety or manage some of your own thoughts so that you can even start to have a meaningful conversation and work through your own inhibitions, the things that are stopping you right now, all the negative thoughts that start coming into your mind when you're just about to step out and go into church and, try to meet some of your friends, say hi, say hello, and you're not really sure about the reaction that's going to come out from them. So I think those are the things that create that pervasive loneliness when we don't have a way to solve for our own inner doubt. And that was the aspect that we were looking at and trying to operationalize, that if we can help manage those internal thoughts, then that's something that could potentially create more social relatedness, more connection. And as Jean was mentioning, that there are definitely a lot of tools that already exist, measures and outcomes that already exist, created by psychologists, that state authorities started using when they were deploying something like a Wysa. So we did a study with the California Mental Health State Authority, and they went out and used this tool called the Kessler's 10 scale, which looks at some of these elements of connection and relatedness. And what they saw was that a lot of individuals, a lot of youth, when they were using Wysa, after that they said that they were feeling more connected, feeling a greater degree of relatability to individuals around them. What they found surprising was that they also gave Wysa to individuals above the age of 65. And they were also feeling better and more connected after something like this. So I don't think we were expecting that either, that individuals who are significantly older in age will adapt to something like a chatbot, but the loneliness was actually much greater there. They didn't really have anyone to talk to, and that became one of the reasons that the technological adaptation was happening so fast in that population.
So belonging, connected, being known.
So I'll give you my answer in a second, but I don't know if anyone in the room has seen the movie, came out last year, Nosferatu. Came out last year, it's a horror movie, decent horror movie. And
No, most of us have not.
okay. There's a scene, well, it's a classic Dracula type story, and a young woman is getting attacked by a vampiric figure. And in between her fevered states, she turns to her fiancé, this is played by Johnny Depp's daughter, and says something that really caught my eye. This is set in Germany, I think, in the 18th, maybe 17th century, 18th century. And she said, when we're in love, from our love, I became as normal. And my ears immediately pricked up because I'm writing a book on normality now, and being kind of a normality nerd, I was like, actually, at that time, no one would understand you if you said, I felt normal. Because normal is actually a relatively new term. It came about in the 19th century out of medicine initially. A lot of French physicians started to define what they called the normal state of an organism versus its pathological abnormal state. And around the same time, you had the birth of statistical sociology or numerical sociology, where we begin to map any number or track any number of human characteristics on a bell curve, typically a bell-shaped curve. The errors cancel each other out, and the area of highest frequency is the average. And there was a Belgian statistician named Adolf Quetelet, who came up with the idea of the average man, the person who perfectly embodied his community's being in terms of girth, height, anything, even suicidality or tendency to divorce and so on. So the reason I mention this is because normal in that sense of it can be very deceiving. And it's a very, it can be a circular kind of reasoning where what's normal? Well, what's prevalent? Why is it prevalent? Because people follow a law of prevalence. That doesn't make sense. It's as a kind of a begging of the question or circular reasoning. And so if you look, for example, and say how many friends people typically have, well, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago that said the average, 1 out of 5 millennials reports that he or she has no friends. And in a way, you could say if that rate goes up, it becomes normal, right? So normal in that kind of quantitative or frequentist sense of it doesn't tell us much. But there is this other element of normal, which is the normative of how things ought to be. And in that sense, if you say what makes human beings happy fundamentally, then we have to go back to Revelation and I think classical thought. And so human beings are social animals, and we seek friendships, and that requires common loves. And so I would identify the opposite of loneliness as having genuine friendships, and it doesn't need to be a huge number, but friendships defined by common loves and a desire to build each other up by, in virtue, which is the highest form of friendship, Aristotle tells us. So
I want to take off on this belonging, connectedness, right? Love, being known. And in February, a month ago, The Atlantic wrote this piece on the antisocial century. An entire article devoted to this new phenomena that people actually want to be alone now, right? And the author wrote about how the fact that almost 30%, how many of you use OpenTable here to reserve for restaurants? Are you familiar with that app? Many of you are familiar with OpenTable. It's this app you can reserve. And 30% increase on dining alone. People want to eat by themselves. And the author speaks about going into a Mexican restaurant, frequented, full, and he said, it's always empty now, except that at the bar, it's full of takeout food that you order, and people just come and pick it up. No one eats inside, they eat in their home. And he went and chronicled all these new things that are happening. He called the antisocial century. And he said, as some of you mentioned, loneliness should be an alarm, as you mentioned, Gene. There's something happening, I need to connect. And yet his concern was the alarm's going off, and a lot more people now seem to say, it doesn't really matter. I actually want to be alone. So I want to ask, how do we get to both either an epidemic of loneliness, the disconnectedness, the lack of friendship, and the inability to work through that, or the other side, the desire to be alone? I don't want to be with people. I'd rather be with my pet.
I'd be interested, just from a research brain, to think about a correlative, because I look at loneliness as a disease pathway, that we're meant to be in connection, which actually helps our cardiovascular systems, it helps our brain health, it helps our breathing. And so if these people are saying, and if there's research out there, it'd be fun to find it, or even do a study of those same people that were surveyed for the Atlantic going, how is your overall physical health? How's your immune system? How often are you getting sick? Yeah. Because we're not just talking about relational things here, and we are, but we're talking about whole health, total health. That the people that are actually alone and isolated are those that are in most poor health.
And again, we've got two things happening. One is that I want to be alone. The other one is I'm suffering from this thing.
Sure.
I have these feelings, and no friends. Maybe I don't know how to have friends. And I feel disconnected. I don't know what to connect with. I feel empty. Or I want to be known, but who will know me? And so there are two different things here happening. How did we arrive at this point? And Gene, you mentioned the data since 2012 and seeing a shift. Yeah. So I want to ask us all to talk about what got us here, because later on we'll talk about hopefully what can help us get out of this. But what brought us to this point? What are the things? I don't think it's just one. What are the things that brought us here, either to the I want to be alone and I'm okay being alone by myself, or I feel alone or lonely and I need help?
I can start with at least
Go ahead,
one.
Please.
Yeah. So that data that I was working on of seeing that decline in young people spending time with each other face to face, but then in particular just the crazy graphs of not a whole lot of change in loneliness and then just goes straight up after about 2012. Same thing with depression. The question that everybody has when they see those trends is what happened? What happened around 2012 that might explain that? And that's the question that I had when I first started to see the trends. They were very unusual. They were clearly not due to economics, because the U.S. economy was finally starting to improve around that time after the Great Recession. It's tough to think of any big event that happened that would have that pervasive an effect. So I puzzled over this for a really long time. It was a huge mystery. And one day I came across a statistic, things started to click into place, that what happened at the end of 2012? That was the first time the majority of Americans owned a smartphone. So the first smartphone was introduced in 2007. Most people had one by the end of 2012. 5.5 years. That is the fastest adoption of any technology in human history. And you can bring it into social situations as well. So not only does it seem to be a communication device, an entertainment device that can sometimes replace that face-to-face social interaction, it can also interfere when we are in person with each other. And there's several social psychology experiments that have done this. They did random assignment, go out to dinner or have a conversation with your friends with your phone available or without your phone available. And when people did not have their phone available, they enjoyed that dinner more. They enjoyed that conversation more. They found it more emotionally fulfilling. There's a bunch of these studies. And the trends just lined up so completely, because smartphones, social media, all of those things just completely changed the way that young people, and really all of us, but particularly young people, were spending their leisure time. Teens' social life just completely changed at that point, spending so much less time with each other in person and so much more time texting on social media and all of those things. And these mechanisms can be very useful for connection in moderation, but we're way past moderation. Gallup found that the average teen in the US, here's your normal thing, spends almost 5 hours a day using social media when you include YouTube and TikTok in that total. So that might be the prevalence, it might be the tendency, it might be normal, but it doesn't fit the other criteria that you mentioned of, is this how it should be? Absolutely not. That's not how it should be, because that's interfering with sleep, it's interfering with family life, and we can clearly see it's also interfering with teens getting together with their friends. And to those who have pushed back and said, well, but, it is connection. It's supposed to help us. social media and all of these things are supposed to help us not be lonely, that you can never be lonely. It's how the tech companies kind of advertise their products. You never need to be lonely. You can always pull up Instagram or Facebook, say. But if that were true, then loneliness should have gone down among teens, and instead it skyrocketed at the time these technologies are becoming popular.
Wish we had still the Blackberries. It was so difficult.
That's right. Or worse, the flip phones where you had to press the same button three times to get one letter on a text. Yeah. One letter.
The whole technology piece is fascinating because arguments have been made that the automobile, television, and air conditioning have also helped to bring more loneliness. Yeah. Right? And I can't think of living without air conditioning.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm confessing, right? Yeah. But air conditioning, you stay in your home. You don't go out. Yeah. When you didn't have it, you were out. Yeah. Right? Automobile, you drive away from people you don't want to see.
Sad but true.
Yeah. Television, you don't have to go out to the world comes to you.
Yeah.
So, to what degree, and you and I talked a little bit about this, but the degree to which technology in general is driving some of this?
Well, I would say too that to the point that Gene was making is we're finally doing some neurological studies and brain studies on the impact of screen times and social media. But part of our developmental, from a developmental standpoint, face-to-face interactions, if I'm gonna say something to you and make you upset, I've got to see the reaction on your face, the nonverbals, and how you're going to react to my mean words, and it's going to affect me, and so I'm going to course correct, and that's the development of our brain, and our kids are not getting that in the way. It
doesn't happen when you text.
No, it doesn't happen when you text, doesn't happen when you leave a comment on a post, and so what we're doing is we're creating a kind of a microcosm of kids that can't pick up on emotional cues. They don't know how to engage relationally. They don't know how to disagree and still walk away as friends. Yeah. And obviously we're seeing that across just turn on the news. We're seeing that across the culture. And so it doesn't give our brain a chance to reach the potential that it needs to have this interaction of, oh, I said something that made you feel uncomfortable. I need to course correct so that I can care for you, being known, being seen, because I care about you. We're missing out on that. Now throw in the COVID pandemic and masks and different things like that, a whole nother conversation, because we weren't able to even see the face, we're just seeing the eyes and that kind of stuff. So I think it's really, things are changing, but I think there's a real crippling of a generation that doesn't know how to interact relationally and emotionally.
You know who's been prophetic on this is the sociologist Bob Putnam, the author of Bowling Alone. Yeah. Of course, he's describing all sorts of causes, including especially television. This is published in '85, I believe.
2000.
2000. But in an afterword, he says, well, there are these new technologies coming around where people can connect on bulletin boards. Facebook wasn't around, Twitter wasn't around back then. And doesn't this challenge your thesis? And in a kind of afterward, he addressed it and he said, well, maybe we'll be more connected. Or it could be that these technologies, by their nature, silo us into ever more kind of particularistic communities, and we don't get to engage with someone who doesn't share our point of view. I mean, we still talk about the mass media. I don't think we have mass media. The mass democratic media was a good thing. It stabilized American culture. There was, it has its flaws to just have 3 network newspapers and 3 network television stations and 3 national newspapers. But it had its virtues too. There was this kind of normalizing quality where you knew what your neighbor was seeing. But we have online communities where people, grown-ups, get their entire worldview from like anime, chat rooms, or from weightlifting. The weightlifting bros might have great insights on weightlifting, but they may not have such great insights unlike politics, you know. Anyway,
Yeah.
so it had, you know, those online communities, have they really connected us? I'm skeptical.
Same thing with the TikTok influencer. Teaches you how to lose weight and then tells you how to vote. Really?
Chaitali, there's something that, you know, when you started Wysa I've been fascinated with the question you asked, and maybe you can share with the audience the question that drove you and your team to create Wysa, this chatbot for mental health, because it's technology, and yet you're trying to solve a very real human problem that at times people don't have anyone to speak with.
Yeah.
So maybe you can share with the audience what you did to leverage technology in a helpful way.
No, absolutely. So Wysa, for the longest time, I mean, still, the subtitle of our app is Friend at 4 a.m. And we chose 4 a.m. for a specific reason, that that's the time when the most number of suicidal intent-oriented calls spike across the world. And that's also the time where there are the least number of helplines available in the world, because most helplines are not 24/7. So they close around midnight or 10 p.m. or so on and so forth across countries, right? So 4 a.m., who do you have to actually speak with when you're working through your worst thoughts, you can't sleep? And can potentially technology play a role here was one of the thoughts with which we created Wysa, and also became the reason why Wysa continues to remain completely free. Like, the chatbot is something that we don't charge for anybody. So anybody from any part of the world can use it. And that's kind of different in some ways from social media, right? So, and I think I'm just kind of bringing out two different sides of technology, that technology potentially can play a role where you can work through your thoughts, can be a space that's almost helping you work through all the ways in which you're inhibited from the world around you. And then there's social media, where you're being prompted to perform as opposed to connect. And that becomes the challenge with social media, which, as Jean was stating, that, you know, it was created with the intent of connecting people. That's usually, quite literally, the tagline for Facebook or Instagram and all of these applications. But it's not so much about figuring a way to meet more people or connect with more people in an authentic manner, but show the best parts of yourself. And that's the only thing that social media is usually present for. It's a display. And that then creates anxiety, that then actually creates more disconnection when you're not being validated on those elements, or you're not being able to share the parts of you that are not as polished or are rougher, or you don't know how to make sense of it. Where do the amorphous parts of you go? Or as Sohrab was just mentioning, that if you're a weightlifting bro, but there are other parts to your personality, where does the rest of you go?
Mm-hmm. So we're beating up on technology quite a bit, and I want to shift to some other potential causes. And I want to ask us to talk about the family and the role of the family in loneliness. The American family, or families in general, are being stretched beyond what's healthy in lots of different ways. And you have young men and women, children, who perhaps have no attention and love at home. And they're learning that and replicating that and have no moral compass. And parents, 2 or 3 jobs at times, stressed out. So let's talk about this very important community of all communities in some ways, a family. And not that it's the problem, but there's something happening there that perhaps could be facilitating some of this too. So maybe you can comment on, Sohrab, let's start with you on the family piece, because it is such an important community, for good or for bad.
So there are the crises that are internal to the American family, not the least of which is the fact that it's not being formed at all in many instances. People aren't getting married, or if they are, they're in kind of irregular cohabiting situations, which, again, as Charles Murray showed in Coming Apart, every other formation is less good in terms of the outcomes for children compared to a man and a woman who are married. So there's that, and I think we've been talking about that, and see, people of faith, Christians especially, have lots of interesting and important answers to give on that. But we also have to look at the kind of economic context which you mentioned. And I think we've created an economy that is just simply too precarious, and we've done it in the search for maximum efficiency, lowering labor costs as much as possible. But the reality is, you know, if you are a a gig worker who has to work in these kind of irregular schedules, or you're an Amazon warehouse worker, you have no sense of regularity, you don't have time to play with your kids. I mean, in my most recent book, Tyranny Inc., I documented this in the case of workers in service and hospitality industries, retail service and hospitality. A third of those workers don't receive notice about what their upcoming week's schedule is going to be like, until days before they actually have to do it. And then they're doing these forms of shifts that are called clopening shifts, where you're in for an hour or two at the beginning, and then you're let off again, and then you have to come back for the closing 1 or 2 hours. What that does to someone who's trying to, for example, raise a kid or care for elders is extremely destructive. And again, there's social science that shows that children of parents who work those kinds of precarious hour jobs, not surprised, I mean, it makes sense, they are more likely to misbehave in school, more likely to feel anxiety, guilt, more likely to be lonely, etc. So those are things where we have to rethink some elements of our political economy, and it has to be, for example, which I support, is the restoration of manufacturing, because manufacturing jobs have this kind of geographic stability, and that's why you had the kind of period post-war of broad-based stability. It was pegged to manufacturing. Service jobs have a different quality, especially for working class people. But even for people in my social class, it's a different kind of precarity. At least it's the sense that we're not precarious, but the constant invasion of work at any hour, right? I wake up and I'm like, oh, email from boss, text message from my blah, blah, blah. That can also be quite destructive if you're trying to have a kind of regular, orderly life that family life demands.
Jean.
Mm-hmm. So I'll kind of take some inspiration here and talk about a bigger cultural trend that I think has an impact here, and in a way that maybe isn't talked about enough. So it's a trend that has some definite upsides. It's what psychologists call a slow life strategy. So it happens in times and places when people live longer, and healthcare is better, and education takes longer to finish, usually in a more technologically complex society. So it's increased over the last few decades, say in the U.S. And it means that people take longer to grow up and longer to grow old. And in that strategy, parents tend to have fewer children and nurture them more carefully. Pretty good description for how we raise kids now. I always think about it in contrast to the fast life strategy, when, mid-20th century, 1950s, people just have a lot of kids and hope it worked out. That's how it used to be done, right? And my mother comes from a family like that, 8 kids on a dairy farm in Minnesota. So, but they had this freedom. They would go kind of do whatever they wanted. I mean, they worked on the farm, but then when they had their free time, my grandparents didn't know where they were. And that lasted, I'm a Gen Xer, that lasted into the Gen X childhood of, you go explore the world with your friends on your bikes, and it's come home when the streetlights come on. That used to be the standard, and now that's not the standard at all, that kids are kept in a much shorter reign. So, all of these things kind of explain a lot of stuff. And once you get to the adolescent years, it means fewer teens get their driver's license, fewer are drinking alcohol, fewer have paid jobs, and fewer are going on dates, and fewer are having sex. And most people are pretty thrilled by some of those trends. I am too. I'm a parent of 3 teenagers, so that's pretty cool. But there's some downsides. They're also not developing independence, and they're not prioritizing. They're also not going out with their friends, as we discussed, and they're not dating. So they're not having this experience with romantic relationships. And then one really key thing in the slow life strategy is people get married later. And that has been happening, that trend's been going on for decades. In 1960, the median age of first marriage for women was 20. So that means half of the women getting married for the first time were teenagers in 1960. And so then it slowly grew from there. And, there's the idea of the boomers in the 60s and early 70s, it was free love and everything. Do you know what the median age of first marriage was then? 21 and a half. So maybe when you were 19, but then you got married pretty soon afterward. And that continued to grow. And now it's about 27 for women, about 28 and a half or so for men. So it's not because of the recession. It has just grown in a very linear way for a very long time. There's huge upsides to this. The divorce rate is actually down, probably partially because fewer people get married in the first place, but also because they're marrying later when they're more mature and more able to handle that responsibility and so on. But what I have always thought was a little bit strange is that system, with all of its advantages, also means that even if you put off dating a little bit to, maybe to late high school or early college, you're dating for a really long time. And that's a time of uncertainty, and am I actually gonna get married? And am I gonna move in with this person? And who knows if we'll actually get married? And that can have its own loneliness to it. And then you have to find the person, and you don't have that one person that has your back and loves you. And that's one definition of marriage, and there's plenty. We talk about defining loneliness. You could find many, many, many things in terms of marriage and what it really means. But that's often what it means to people. And so people are spending, especially in their 20s, less time in that state. And we don't have the standard anymore of we're gonna get married young and then we're gonna build our lives together. Instead, it's we're gonna be really stable, we're gonna do everything first, and then we're gonna get married. Those two things have flipped.
Chaitali?
Yeah, I'll mention maybe two things that were coming to mind. One is that it's interesting that in some ways there's a lot more vigilant parenting or helicopter parenting that we speak about right now in the family unit. But at the same time, when we speak about meaningful connection or a child being able to talk to their parent about everything and anything, is that really happening, and is that reducing the loneliness within the family? Those two things are actually quite distinct, they're quite different. And so there's a lot more vigilant parenting in that sense. It feels like there's a lot more connection and interchange of messages, communication that's happening, but it's not really reducing the distance that's being experienced within the family. So I think that was one thought that was coming to my mind. And the other was migration, which is, I think, a reflection of the economics of particular cities, of states, that it's hard to live around your family very often, right? So we all migrate for jobs, for sometimes for relationships, and that can be really hard. I was reading this particular anecdote about an individual from Mexico who married someone in Michigan. And she was talking about that when she first moved to Michigan, she was struggling to remember what it felt like to live near the seashore. And that was one of the things she was relating to a therapist about what made her feel lonely. That it's an absence also of all the contextual cues that you've grown up with. So of course it's an absence of the family, of the relationships, but also all the things that ground us, right, in life. And all of them suddenly change because of one massive change in our life, whether that's a job or a relationship. And that can really, really add and exacerbate that loneliness that we're feeling in our lives. But we want to hold on to the good things too. So how do we balance that? That becomes tricky. And it becomes hard to then create a stable family unit for the next generation because of how you're feeling inside. We are still in the middle of this transition and you don't really know who you are in this new context fully.
Mark, you counsel young men and women, teenagers. You've heard your colleagues here speak about various things with the family. Mm-hmm. Tell us from your experience. I mean, you've started a couple of organizations. Mm-hmm. No Student Left Behind or something akin to that. Just what's happening in the family that could be contributing to the rise in loneliness?
Yeah, I do therapy very differently now with my teenage clients. So I'll sit down with a family at an intake and I'll say, you can find out what's going on. Usually the teenager is the identified patient. They're the ones that are behaving not the way that the family wants. And so they're the ones that get kind of targeted as the identified patient. So I'll sit there and do an intake with them. And then I'll sit down with the family and I'll sit down with the mom and dad and say, listen, I would love to work with your teen, but every third session you have to come in as well and we're doing a family session. And if you don't agree to that, I'm not seeing your teen. And they're like, oh, it's not my fault, it's their fault. And we get into it and we find out really quickly that mom and dad have issues that they've buried, that they've not dealt with. They have their own traumas, they have their own anxieties, they have their own struggles. And albeit they're doing the best they can with what they have, they need to work those things out. And I always tell parents, it's not about what you say, it's about how you show up. Mm. And I do an exercise with parents. I say, close your eyes and tell me something that your mom and dad told you when you were a kid. And they can't think of anything. Mm. But I said, now, find that memory again. How did you feel in that moment? And they can immediately tell me how they felt. And so I said, this is what we're doing with your kids too. So you're trying to lecture your kid, you're trying to control your kid, helicopter, all these types of things. And all they want you to do is show up. And when you show up without an agenda, show up without judgment or without shame, and give them a chance to engage in their story. And so I tell parents this: become a student of your child. Know them. You have to look at them. You have to see them. Dr. Daniel Siegel in his attachment theory, interpersonal neurobiology and attachment stuff, really talks about this idea of being seen. So you notice something's off with your kid. I coach parents and say this: don't say what's wrong. Why are you having an attitude? What's bothering you? You can say, hey, I'm noticing that something's not right. I'm ready, and here's the key phrase: I'm ready to listen when you want to talk. Because what that communicates is, I am a safe place for you to come and dump your stuff. And parents, I tell parents all the time, don't come with a response. Come trying to ground yourself. Come listening. And then when they're done talking, ask them this question: what would you like me to do with that information? And what that does is it puts back in the, and this is especially good with preteens and teenagers, is it gives them an opportunity to go, okay, mom and dad are safe places for me to come and talk. I'm not going to be shamed or judged. Now, parents, I always tell them, you might need to have a counselor or a friend you call afterwards because you're dysregulated now because of what your kid has told you. You don't want to take it out on them, but you need to have somebody to talk to. And it's all about that presence piece. And I tell parents this: you have one or two opportunities when your kids hit that preteen stage to get it right. I said rupture and repair is what we talk about in attachment all the time. When we have a rupture, we can own our stuff, we can make that repair, and research shows that our attachment to that child is going to be stronger than it was before the rupture. But we've got to be pretty quick at making those repairs. And so I have a almost 17-year-old daughter, and I find every opportunity to be side by side. So, and she's not driving yet. We live in Houston, Texas. I wouldn't wish my worst enemy to learn how to drive in Houston, Texas. So she's learning she's getting there. But I value the driving. I'll take her different places, and we just have side-by-side conversations. I ask a question, and I just let her talk. And then when she's really struggling, she knows that she can come to us, and it's usually my bedtime. I mean, it's usually like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night where she's like, okay, I'm ready to talk. Okay, here we go. But what it's doing is it's creating an ecosystem in our home for her to go, okay, I am safe to launch. I am safe to go out. I'm safe. I know what safe relationships look like. I know what they feel like. I'm a better gauge of friends that I engage with. And I think if we take that and make that a priority of our family systems, I'm going to get biblical here for a minute. We are the chief disciplers of our kids. The world should not be doing that. We need to do that. And this is a part of it. And so part of that, guys, might be that we need to go and say, you know what? I need to go get some therapy. My trauma has not been resolved, and I'm taking it out on my kids, intentionally or unintentionally. My anxiety is through the roof, and I'm trying to hold it all together, but my kids can feel the anxiety in the house, and they're reacting to it. So sometimes the hardest part for closing the gap in this loneliness conversation is that we deal with our own stuff first. And that's scary, but it's so beneficial and so powerful.
I want to ask us, as we continue to discuss causes and before we go to solutions, loneliness both is a transcendent part of humanity versus loneliness as a result of context, right? I mean, we can talk about the modern city as a very lonely kind of place, right? I think England right now, over the next 2 years, there's a town in England being built that will model a 14th century town, the first time it's ever happened in centuries. Mm-hmm. Because they want to build a town for community. Mm-hmm. It hasn't happened in centuries, right? So we can speak about, when I go to New York, I call it the concrete jungle.
Many do.
It can grind you down. There's something about that city, and cities can do that to you, right? And so we can talk about the context things, the kinds of things that make us lonely because the city is the way that it is, it's organized a particular way, the workplace and the cubicle farms are organized a particular way. But can we talk about loneliness as being part of the human condition, right? There's something about us as humans that because of our creatureliness, our finiteness, but also the moral condition of being fallen creatures, right? And that separate ourselves from God, from each other, right, because of our sin. and the need for communion, relationship with God, relationship with others, the two great commands of Jesus. That you'll love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and that you'll love your neighbors yourself. These two relational dynamics to bring real connectedness between myself and God and myself and others. So there seems to be this endemic loneliness that follows us throughout history, and then the contextual one. So can we talk a little bit about both of those, please? So let's start with you. I'll give you the easy one.
That's a great question. I mean, as a Christian, I believe as a matter of faith that God himself is relationship. God is love, right? It's a Trinitarian love. And so part of the loss that came with the fall is being expelled from relationship, but then called back through this great sacrifice of the cross. But I'm trying to hold that thought, but then also remember that a certain kind of loneliness from our fellow beings can be the source of communion with God, right? Like we're in Lent right now, and our Lord has this element of often like going into the desert to be with the Father, right? Like, and so that's not loneliness, right? That's the contemplative life. We need that space for ourselves to fill back up before we can go out into the community.
Almost like fasting, withdrawing to pursue.
Yes. So that we are relational beings. We worship a relational God and a personal God at the same time. We need contemplation. We need prayer. We need some alone time as well. And I think that's something that Jean said as well. That you can be fulfilled and not be like a social butterfly all the time as well. So we shouldn't confuse those two things.
So there's a degree to which loneliness can't ever go away, right? And then there are degrees that we can. It can. That's contextual ones, perhaps.
I think it's very contextual. I mean, you think about societies in the past, whether you're talking about a hunter-gatherer society or just, I don't know, in Western Europe 200 years ago, or even sometimes I think about like the stereotypical like really big Irish family, in a East Coast city in the U.S. in like 1960, or an Amish community now. So they're surrounded by people all the time. So, loneliness isn't unknown in those communities, but it's fairly rare. So there's other emotions that tend to happen. Like, I don't know, sometimes I think about that stereotypical Irish family, maybe 7 kids in a house, and you're annoyed with people all the time. You're frustrated, your sister, stole your stuff, and you have to share a room with 2 of your siblings. And if you're mom or dad, you're probably pretty overwhelmed. But even when the kids leave the house, and there's so many of them, and then they come back with their grandchildren, and there's always somebody in that house. And maybe I'm thinking of an Italian family of the same type of thing, because there's always food and there's always people, and it's just the emotions are just different. Instead of that loneliness, it's just getting fed up with other people and not having the alone time. It's like having the opposite problem. And then that just shifted. It shifted so much over the decades, where people don't have as many children anymore, and people get married later, and many more people live alone. And older people, instead of moving in with their children, are in a senior center, and there's just a lot more isolation and thus a lot more loneliness.
Yeah. To add to that, it's interesting. So there were a couple of researchers who actually did a study to look at when did the word loneliness start popping up across literature. So across the 1800s, 1700s, you usually notice that loneliness first started coming into the English language to only describe physical loneliness. So it wasn't being used as a term to describe anything emotional in nature. Shakespeare, across all of his works, used loneliness maybe 20 times. So lonesome, loneliness started coming somewhere around then. But it was that sparse across that massive body of work. And then slowly it became something that was starting to get described as something that was emotive in nature. So it's definitely something that we see some kind of generational trend, right? Like there's something that's changed about the way we even conceptualize loneliness in our minds, what that word means. And I think to Dr. Moreno's point, there's definitely, I think the positive way of looking at loneliness also is that for every thesis you need an antithesis. So if we need to experience connection in this world, we also need to understand what is the absence of connection. Yeah. So from that perspective, loneliness can potentially create more within us, more capacity within us to even understand the beauty of connection and the power of connection to transform relationships. And so from that perspective, loneliness has its own place in the world.
Mark?
Yeah, it's interesting. In some of my own research for some of my books, I've looked theologically at the fall and looking at when the fall happened. We know sin and separation entered into the world. But I started doing some searching in the Hebrew of is there a term for relationship? And there wasn't. Mm-hmm. What I found was the term came up in the Hebrew language was fellowship and redemption. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was really beautiful because when we have separation, to your point, the English language didn't have loneliness yet, but the separation piece, well, how do we bridge the gap of separation? Well, it's the redemptive work of fellowship. Mm-hmm. And that fellowship means that we're not just in relationship. Honestly, I don't like the word relationship because it's just kind of benign. But where fellowship means that I'm going to be intentional about leaning into your story and your life. I tell my students at CCU all the time that trauma happens in fellowship and relationship and connection, and it's bad, right? We create trauma bond, all the body reacts to that. But interestingly enough, the only way that trauma can be healed is in connection and in fellowship and in relationship. And so I love what you were saying, Chaitali, is just the antithesis, of how if we need to experience what that feels like so we know what it's like when it's not there, mm-hmm. and so that we're able to connect. And so I think from a biblical and spiritual standpoint, to recognize that Christ's pursuit of us is the desire to bridge that gap of separation through fellowship and redemption, which should bridge the gap of loneliness. It's not meaning that it's ever going to go away. It's an existential question, right? We look at René Descartes, Kierkegaard, all the philosophers of, what does it mean to be in this world? What does it mean to be, what's my purpose? What's my identity? Where do I belong? And then what does it mean when I die? And we have those questions all the time that are going to produce that anxiety that's going to spur on some of that lonely aspects. But then in community and in fellowship is where we find that commonality and that healing. And I really believe that places of faith have an opportunity to step in and create the antithesis to loneliness.
We're making a shift to our possible solutions. And Gene, I want to start with you here because you've done extensive work on generations and generational differences. We have an audience here of students and different generation groups here. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about the differences between generations when it comes to the social connectedness, mm-hmm. and the loneliness piece and the fellowship piece? Things that we should be on the lookout for. I'm thinking many of us here are dealing with aging parents, yeah. right, who are encountering loneliness, difficult loneliness all of a sudden, right? Mm-hmm. You and I were discussing, I was sharing with you just the transition of children from a child to an adult, how difficult that separation is for a parent, right? As a child becomes a teenager and an adult. Yeah. So these things are real. Every time I meet with incoming students during Golden Eagle days, I always tell the parents, how many of you this is your first child? Mm-hmm. We're praying for you. Yeah. Right? And then I look at the young people, and men and women, and I can tell they're excited, right? Yeah. The parents are grieving, the students are happy. Right. They're moving on. So significant differences, all dealing with loneliness in different ways, connectedness in different ways. What have you discovered?
Yeah. It's so funny you'd say that because I have an 18-year-old who's going to be going off to college, and I had to go through that experience you're describing early because she left for Navy boot camp a month ago. And you can't text or call or have or FaceTime in Navy boot camp. You can only write letters. So, and that's my first child. So it was even harder, I think, than it would have been had she gone to college and I could have called her the next day. And it is difficult. I didn't know whether to be happy or sad that she was sad too. But maybe that's because she was going to boot camp. Not just that she was leaving home and her parents, but that was in there. But yeah, I mean, then that really has shown, a lot of what we're talking about today about that connection. And when she did get to call us for the first time, just like, I was so much happier the rest of that day than I had been. And it does, really, really illustrate that power of connection. So, in terms of like the where do we go piece, how they say when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So I study teenagers, my kids are teenagers, so I'm often thinking from that perspective, and I teach undergraduates who are mostly 19 to 26 or so. So I think a lot about the solutions that we can start there with young people and try to figure out this problem a little bit more. And you can think about it from the individual level, the small group level, and then the big group. So on the individual level, it's in some ways the hardest part of trying to find a balance with technology where you're going to see other people in person instead of doing social media. But social media is social. This is a social problem. It's very hard for individuals to solve this. So I give a lot of talks at middle schools, high schools, and that is perpetually the issue. They know this. They know it's a problem that they're spending so much time on their phones and not as much time with each other. They absolutely know that, and they're not saying, "Oh, you old person, you don't know," which was kind of surprising to me at first when and about 2018 or so when I first started giving these talks. But they are absolutely aware of it, and the problem is they don't know how to solve it within the social context. So I started telling them, well, here's just a small place to start. Have a conversation with your friends and say, okay, we're going to move off social media for making our plans. We're going to do a group text instead, and we're going to try to get together more face-to-face. And we're also, we might take breaks from our phones. The number one thing I tell people is get your phone out of your bedroom at night because you will sleep so much better. And if you wonder with that, wait, how can I do that? Because my phone's my alarm clock. I have advice for you. Buy an alarm clock. You can buy it on Amazon on your phone and then put your phone away and get a good night's sleep. It works. And that's sometimes a tough sell to people of all ages, but especially teens and young adults who that's just the only world they've ever known is having that phone on the bedside table. Plus, they are afraid that if their friend texts them or their friend posts something on Instagram and they don't like it right away or they don't reply to the text right away, that their friend will think that they're mad at them. I hear this all the time. And I think particularly with texting, it's that idea, there's this expectation of instant response that's also clearly generational. That doesn't happen as much among older generations, but with the young generation, that's you gotta reply right away. So I say, have that conversation with your friends of, sometimes I'm gonna take a break. I also, and I say, blame it on your parents if you want to. My parents are lame. They made me put my phone outside my bedroom, even if you like the idea and you sleep better. Sometimes I'm not going to be able to respond to you right away, and that does not mean I'm mad at you. I still like you. We're still friends, but I can't always respond right away because there's going to be times and places when I need a break from that phone, especially at night.
Mark?
I want families to think about creating a family mission statement and creating a culture around this, because mom and dad are just as guilty as the kids, right? And so I have this document that I walk families through in my sessions of a step-by-step how to create a family mission statement. Who do we want to be known for outside of the family, inside the family? How do we want to treat each other? What's our philosophy on tech? What's our philosophy on a bunch of different questions to guide it? And I said, if you've got kids older than the age of 7, have them all sit around the table and have input into this. Because when you get buy-in from your kids and you get buy-in from your family, it's gonna happen. There'll be natural consequences. They'll be the ones that can create consequences. My daughter did this to me yesterday. Dad, you're on your phone. It's past 6 o'clock. I'm like, dang it, here's your phone. She took it downstairs and put it on the counter. This is what our agreement was in our family mission statement. So they have ownership in that, and they help us out as well. But if you're not on the same page, you're on no page. And so to sit down together and to really work through these things creates community, it creates connection. At the time, when we did this for the first time, we reevaluate this about every 6 months, but my 5-year-old, who's now 11 at the time, just blurted out, "Pizza and movie night on Friday nights." Sweet. So every Friday night for the last 6 years has been pizza night and movie night, because it was her idea. And she lets everybody know that it was her idea. And we don't buy store-bought pizza. We sit in the kitchen, we work together, we make our own dough, we do a lot of things together in that sense, and they have ownership. And that has helped in some of these harder conversations that we've had to have, and it helps in that connective piece. And so I think and parents, hear me say this, we have to be less busy so we can be more intentional. And so there's things in your life that you maybe need to say no to. Being out every night of the week because your kid's good at dance and violin and sports and that kind of stuff, great. If they're not going to get a scholarship or go be a professional, pick one. Because when you pick one, you still engage team dynamics, you still engage, working through it together. But now you've got time around the dinner table. Now you've got time for conversations. Now you've got time for some of these things it's never going to return void. It's always going to produce the blessing that it needs to.
Mark, you mentioned something about culture building. I want to ask you, Sohrab, about this. Building a culture in the family. I want to talk about the culture outside of the family. Society, politics, the city. Talk to us about what do you think are the kinds of cultural shifts, changes that could be made, right?
Yeah, many of them, but I'll just suggest a one-word one, which is Sabbath. Yes. At one point during his presidency, a Connecticut magistrate gave a citation to George Washington because he was riding his horse on a Sunday between New York and Connecticut. So that just goes to show you that the United States, even going back to colonial times, and then during the founding and the early republic, had this Sabbatarian dimension, had this Sabbatarian tradition. And in fact, the last statewide, what's called blue law, was only abolished in 2018 in North Dakota. And it wasn't like the woke left that did it. It was Chamber of Commerce Republicans who did it because they wanted, shopping all the time, everyone, and and it was sold as freedom, right? It's sort of sold as liberation, but it's not liberation for the worker who has to work those hours. The deprivations that are imposed on other people of what the experience, the rich experiences that they can lose. I want to read this quote from Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, a great Hasidic mystic, who said, "The Sabbath is not for the sake of the weekdays are for the sake of the Sabbath. It is not an interlude, but the climax of living," because, of course, there is the element of worship involved in that, but Sabbath also means setting aside one day when we're not competing, where we're not seeking efficiency, uber alles, we're not just trying to dominate nature and our fellow human beings, but trying to just be. Just relax with each other. And even if some people will use that time to just get more Netflix and whatever, I think a lot of those people who say they want to be lonely have no other option and are sort of coping and saying, I just want to be lonely. This is, just like young men who say, I don't want to get married because it's terrible. I've seen, what they really are saying, I can't. I'm having struggle in the market. In the dating market, that's what I mean. And last note on this, the kind of the centrality of the notion of Sabbath to communion. It's interesting. If you ask most people, what happened in Exodus? What was God demanding that the Pharaoh do? Most people will say God was asking the Pharaoh to let my people go so they can go establish a political community in the Promised Land. And that was a kind of ultimate goal of it, but that's not the immediate demand. What he does command is, let my people go so that they can serve me in the wilderness. And when they get to the wilderness, immediately what comes down? Well, among others, remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor, do all your work, etc., etc. So the idea of Sabbath, of rest, is really deeply bound up with the idea of communion in the biblical vision. And it's not crazy. I address secular audiences and they think, wow, what a crazy idea, restoring the Sabbath laws. But as though Americans' grandparents and great-grandparents lived in a totalitarian state where you couldn't shop all the time. What a horror. So that's completely possible. Maybe it can be voluntary. Maybe it can begin with some businesses beginning to reimpose the Sabbath voluntarily on themselves, and it can be legislated. I mean, the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled that even though, yes, the Sabbatarian tradition has a religious component, it is not a violation of that those laws aren't a violation of the First Amendment. In other words, it's not on First Amendment grounds that we lost the American Sabbath. So I think that's a decent start. And last point on this is, through the 19th century, American evangelicals tried to get postal delivery on Sunday banned. Constantly failed in Congress. It wasn't until the early 20th century when they linked up with the nascent labor movement. So it was a kind of alliance of religious folks, especially evangelicals, and the labor movement that got us the fact that on Sundays mail doesn't deliver anymore. Now Jeff Bezos has got it back, where postal workers now are delivering again for his company. But I can tell you of the unusual political alliances that can be struck in favor of being together, genuine, authentic communion, and not just efficiency over everything else.
Gene, you said this is one of the tough ones for you, the policy piece, right? And you just mentioned a number of things culturally, politically that could be done labor-wise, but other things that you think can build a culture to really minimize the loneliness, bring more connectedness. What would those be from a policy standpoint?
Yeah. First, I have to say the summary of your point is everybody should be Chick-fil-A, right? Good way to summarize it, because they've been very successful and have been closed on Sundays. It's
and
a
it's
remarkable
delicious.
Story. Yeah, exactly. So the policy piece is always going to be tough, but if you start with schools, there are some things you can do. So something that has finally started to gain steam is the idea of no phones during the school day, bell to bell. So up until this point, it was more common for it to be classroom by classroom. Well, that causes problems because then the cool teacher lets me use the phone, and then the mean teacher doesn't. It's an unhealthy dynamic. But the focus solely on classroom use ignores the loneliness and social interaction and community piece that we're discussing. Because when that phone is available at lunch, it is used at lunch. And high school, middle school cafeterias are eerily quiet a lot of times because everybody's on the phone. They're not interacting with each other. One talk that I gave recently at a high school in Texas, a sophomore young man came up and said, I really want to talk to my friends at lunch. That's our time during the day to really have connection. I really want to do that. But they all want to play games on their phones. What do I do? And that was so hard. My heart broke a little bit because what can I tell him to do? Again, it's social. You have to have the buy-in from everybody. But if his school said no phones bell to bell, there you go, done. Nobody's got the phone. So I think that we do have to think about policy. We do have to think about group solutions in this area in particular, with anything around connection, but particularly things around technology, particularly for teens where they don't want to do it if their friends aren't doing it. And their friends are there, and if their friends are using their phones, then what else can they do? That social interaction piece, you can't do that alone. So it has to be in policy. So I think that's one really solid place to start. Something else that I and many others have been advocating for recently is no social media until age 16. So right now, the minimum age is 13. So first, that was chosen as a compromise with the tech companies in 1998, by the way. So before we had any social media, really, or most of the internet, it was a compromise. No developmental psychologist or parent or educator said, hey, 13, right at puberty, that's the perfect time to introduce social media. Like, no one would have ever argued this or even be introduced to the internet. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So this idea that being internet adulthood, it's way too soon. There's a lot of development that happens over those 3 years. But if you're going to do that, you have to actually make sure you know how old someone is. And guess what they don't do? Age isn't verified. Parental permission isn't required. So if a 9-year-old wanted to get a TikTok account, They just check a box or lie about their birthday and they're in. Same thing for Pornhub, by the way. So it's not even just social media. There's all these other things out there that kids should not be exposed to, and they just have to click a couple boxes and they're in, and the videos are already running. I mean, when you find this stuff out, it's really, really shocking. Even though I've done this research for a while now, a lot of these things were really shocking to me once I figured out, just how easy it is for kids to get on these things. So, raise the minimum age to 16, actually verify age. It can absolutely be done. There's so many different ways and so many different companies that will verify age now. They have their own trade association, and it lists all of the different ways they can verify age. It doesn't have to be a government ID necessarily. So it is doable, but the tech companies don't want to do it because it undermines their bottom line. They make a lot of money off of our kids. There was a conversation that got leaked that a Facebook executive said that the lifetime value of a 13-year-old, I forget what the number was, but it was something like $172. Our kids are worth more than that, and we got to change that.
Chaitali?
I'll add to 2 points. I think from a policy perspective, it's definitely worth thinking about that community groups, right? Whether it is around a particular kind of concern or condition that you're managing at any point in time, or if you're managing any illness, or if you're in a particular generation, any of those possibilities, there aren't enough groups where you can talk about these things. And there was a study that happened, I think about 10 or 15 years ago, that the highest rated primary care practitioners were the ones who were talking to their patients the most. Not that they were giving the best treatment, but they were just talking to their patients the most. Because the patients who were recurring and would come again and again into the PCP waiting room were the folks who didn't have anyone to speak to. And that's something that can be solved at a societal and somewhat informal level, but also at a policy level. And the other thing I wanted to also add to Mark, as you were saying earlier, that the family mission statement is such a beautiful idea. And one thing that we don't think about enough and haven't introduced into this conversation yet is the role of grandparents. That's such an important role and something that immediately starts creating more cohesion within the family if the grandparents are also present in the conversation and are a part of how we visualize the family unit. The visualization of the family unit in itself has become more and more nuclear. And that's also something that puts an excessive amount of burden on only the parent to manage those two jobs that we were talking about, which is so true for so many Americans, and at the same time be the person who's providing soul nourishment for the child, who needs more sources of emotional nourishment, needs more wisdom, and the grandparent has lived through 50, 60, 70 years of life and needs someone to talk to as well. So you're solving two parts of the loneliness problem at one time.
Thank you. Mark, you've been a pastor, so talk to us about churches and the role of churches. I mean, from a political standpoint or in the civic organization, it's more than that. These are communities of believers, faith, scriptures, worship. What's the role of the church in churches and pastors and the layperson to address this within the church and outside of it?
Well, I'm going to start with that. It's a great question. I think we don't need to be afraid to enter the public sector and to advocate for our kids. And I think for some reason along the way as Christians in the church, we have gotten afraid of taking a stand policy-wise or politically. And I think we need to be more of a voice in there, or a voice of reason in some ways. So I tell parents all the time, don't come in angry, but come in with a group, a community, and advocate to your school board for no phones bell to bell, and provide the research. Write your congressman or woman and ask them what kind of legislation is being coming up for mental health. And I think there's opportunities for us to get in the community and be that grassroots of taking the love and the care that Christ commands us to do into our communities, but also what can we do to set up these boundaries and these guardrails. I love the no social media till 16. And I wonder what that will do to, the brain development of our kids and those kinds of things. So how do we advocate for that kind of stuff? I would love it, to be honest, if we see our state governments or our national government do what England did and create a minister of loneliness that is now taking charge of all these conversations, bringing think groups together, think tanks together, and helping engage on what is faith community's responsibility, what's the family's responsibility, what's the business place responsibility with the Sabbath conversation, all these kinds of things. And there's multifaceted ways that we can come about this, but we need somebody or something kind of centered around that. And I think the church can be poised to do that well if we would actually work together and get along interdenominationally as well.
As we close out, I would like to ask each of you to talk to us about the kind of virtues, moral excellences that we need to exhibit to address this loneliness in our own lives and the lives of others. Mm-hmm. And Jean, you and I were talking before, and you mentioned courage, mm-hmm. and we talked about humility. Mm-hmm. But can we talk about those individual virtues? Because to some degree, if I know someone is lonely or experiencing loneliness, I need to do something. The should, right? The norm. I ought to do something. And what does that mean, and how do I do that, right? Or I remember one time during the pandemic, an individual telling me, you know what, I'm fine all by myself. I don't need anyone to come see me here. And I went to see him to have a conversation. Yeah. But how do we do that in a world where, quote unquote, we're connected, but we really are not? Mm-hmm. Or in a world where people say the best neighbors are the ones with the tallest fences, right? How do we break through that culture of you're there, I'm here, the moat around my home, the fence between us, right? Whatever it is, to reach out, to love, to bring about communion and intimacy. How do we do that? So maybe the last word for each of you to share with us. Mm-hmm. We have students here, faculty, staff, friends of the university, different generational groups, but we all have a role to play individually. It's one thing to talk about policy and structures, but there's a lot that can be done at the individual level. Mark, let's start with you.
I think we need to have boundaried persistence, meaning that we're not going to lose ourselves to take care of somebody else. So we need to know who we are in that moment and be persistent with people. So I love your story. I'm fine, and you showed up anyways. That probably meant the world to that person. But I also think we need to be teachable and we need to be vulnerable because we need to be the first to admit that I haven't figured it out yet and I'm still trying to figure it out. And so when we do that, we enter into a mutuality with the person that's struggling. But sometimes just being the first one to say, hey, I've not got it figured out. Here's what I'm trying. Let me share my story. Can you relate? Breaks down some of those barriers.
Mark, thank you. Chaitali.
Vulnerability was the one I was going to go and say as well. That, when someone is struggling to come to terms with even finding the language for their own loneliness, being able to share our own story of the last time we were struggling, or what we are experiencing right now, or the parts that we are feeling unclear about really, really helps bring out their story. And that's so important, just putting words to what we're experiencing inside first.
Mm-hmm. Jean?
Yeah, so glad you cued me with the courage part, because there's some really interesting social psychology studies. If you ask people, what do you think? If you strike up a conversation with somebody on the train, how are you going to feel afterward? Most of them are like, God, that sounds terrible. I don't want to do that. And then when they do experiments and they have people actually do it, how they feel afterward? They feel great, and they feel more connected, and they feel happier. So I think that's, just taking maybe a little bit of a risk, talking to people as you go about your life really can make a difference. It really is like one of those small things that makes a day easier and happier. And here in the Midwest, you can do that. Where I live in California, people look at you a little weird. I'm a Midwesterner, for most of my life, and it is something where we can have those just little connections, as well as having and really prioritizing those deeper connections. And that takes courage too, sometimes, in our current culture, where it has the attitude of, you were talking about the loneliness in language, and there's great databases you can look at this, like Google Books. And if you look at the phrase never compromise, it's gone way up in language use. Guess what's horrible for relationships? Thinking that you should never, ever compromise. It just doesn't work. So, I think we have so much of that emphasis on, I can be happy alone, never compromise, and so on. There's just so much push in that direction, when sometimes maybe we're going to want to compromise a little bit to have those deeper relationships, and then, with luck, not be lonely.
Thank you. Sohrab.
I don't know if there's a one-word virtue for this, but it's a saying from someone I look to. His name's Saint Jose Maria Escriva, and he says, "Don't say such and such a person annoys me. Say he or she sanctifies me." And in a completely unrelated way, I want to tell you about my in-laws. So I was kind of when I was in my early 20s or mid 20s, and my wife and I were engaged. I was that kind of no compromise person, and one of the things I said was like, love for your parents to visit, but just for like a couple hours, not. And now that I have kids, and this really, I'm just underscoring Chaitali's point. Like, I'm like, when is grandma coming? Because it makes so much sense. There's, first of all, they get a benefit from it. It keeps them young to look after our kids. The kids get a benefit from it because generational wisdom is handed down, as she said. And the things that you think might be annoying, after a while, you're like, oh, actually, that's pretty nice. So, reaching out to a difficult relationship a relationship that you think might be difficult, and then you're suddenly rewarded for it amply. So, don't say that person annoys me. Say they sanctify me.
I mean, I want to just summarize by saying there's a significant amount of self-sacrificial love that we're talking about here. That you really have to be willing to lay down your life for others, right? To be able to sanctify them or help them be sanctified. And that's part of the issue here as well. Otherwise, if we don't do that, the loneliness will continue. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for this evening. Thank you all so much. And as we make our way off the stage, I want to ask Dr. Rick Kuhl, our chair of the board, to come and close our evening with prayer and some announcements. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Kuhl, chair of the board of trustees.
Thank you. Am I on the air? All right. By the way, Mr. President, did you say that they're going to be in the lobby and they will greet people, answer any more questions?
Correct.
All evening long. A couple of us have to fly to California tomorrow, so we'll keep it short. And by the way, I just want to thank our president for having the vision to do this. I speak on behalf of our board of trustees, and we love this guy. He's a man with vision. He's a man with passion. And I'm going to say this, he is the real deal. And so we appreciate that. We appreciate the panelists. Go out and congratulate them for what they do. They'll be out there as long as they can stand it tonight. And also I want to thank the rest of you that are here to see the community come out to these. I love them. I fly in from California. I'm here as chairman of the board, yes, but this is one of my favorite all-time activities. And I appreciate the board letting me be their representative. I follow in some great tradition. Carol Boss for 6 years prior to me, and then Steve Hawks, who is down here as chairman of the board prior to Carol. And we just appreciate the opportunity to lead the institution. You say, what's next? What's next? Well, we're going to get you out of here in a second, but I think up on the screen we're going to see the next activity. It is the family, strengthening and healing the fabric of our nation. That one's going to be a great one. And so we would encourage you to mark the time down. It is October 2nd that'll take place. Come on out for that. Also, it was really interesting when I got into town. I rented a car at the airport. I was driving here. I was listening to WCSG, of course, and I heard something about SOAR. And then I saw something on television about SOAR. And then I called my old high school locker mate, and I called him up. We both graduated from Wyoming Park High School, and I talked to him about organizing a 60-year reunion next year. I know you say you can't be that old. You have no idea. We're going to have a reunion. And he said, by the way, I saw something on TV about a program called SOAR. He said, this thing sounds great. He and I were superintendents at the same time out in California. And so we've had a lifelong relationship. And he said, this is phenomenal. And so we just keep hearing about SOAR. As a matter of fact, as I was out in the lobby, some students came in and said, we saw you on a video Monday I said, oh yeah, that's right. I cut a video showing the program and talking on behalf of the board, how we were just delighted when we heard about this program. And also you have heard that, I think it was Tuesday, our president spoke in front of 40, by Zoom, he spoke to 40 of the leading CEOs of West Michigan and the Midwest. And we're talking major corporations, and presented what this program will do for them as they are looking for trained people in business. I've got a daughter who's a single mom and would like to go to college, but she's working now. And she's the type of person that a program like this, she and many others, the military out where we live, and so many other things. And so as we start looking at what this could do for Cornerstone University, our board is just really, really thrilled. And by the way, that was Dr. Moreno's idea also. He is a creative man. I don't know how he does all that he's doing, but he just keeps going at it. So pray for us as we do that. There's one more thing, and I don't know if I'm okay to do this, but I'm going to do it anyhow. Is it okay to pray for your basketball team to win? Steve Hawks, you and I played basketball here, didn't we? So is it okay? All right, he was one of the chairs also of the board, and we played basketball. Steve was pretty good. I wasn't, but I still played. And when I saw that our guys are taking, what is it, tomorrow night? Yeah, they start the tournament. I'm not going to pray for them to win, but as I close, I'm going to pray that every one of these guys plays up to their maximum capacity. And I think we'll win if we do that. All right, let's all stand, and I'm going to close this in a word of prayer. Our Father, we just thank you for the men and women that were on this stage and their commitment to dealing with loneliness. Now, to make it personal, Father, there are people here tonight that are lonely. I suppose all of us get a little lonely at times, but others struggle with it more. And Father, I just pray that Jesus Christ might be closer to them tonight, that they might turn to him, the friend we can have in Jesus, that others of us might look for other people that we can reach out to. Father, so many times we get so busy and in such a hurry, we forget about relationships. And Father, I pray that we will invest in the lives of other people. Now, Father, as we go our separate ways, we just pray for your blessing in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.